Okay, so I wanted to show you how to link a details view control to a form. I already started an example, so I'm going to open that up. Projects. Okay, Visual Studio, projects, junk, website. Junk. Okay. There. Okay. So this is a website that I already kind of started. What it does is, if there's already a database in the background, it's a SQL database. So you can't really see the database here, but it's connected to the database, and what it does is it brings up a drop-down menu and a details. This is called, in Visual Studio's C# it's called details view control. And so if you just have a simple details view control, it'll just show one object or one item in the database. If you've connected it to a drop-down, say, then whenever you select something else on the drop-down, that the information for that specific object will show up in the details view. And this can be very useful, so we're going to show you how to do that. Okay, so as usual, I start out with a split screen, and this is what I have so far. I'm going to show you from scratch how I did this. So we're just going to make the exact same thing. First, I'm going to need two web items. I'm going to have the drop-down list. Then after that, I'm going to have the details view control. That you'll find in the data link to the toolbox. Details view. Now each one of these items or controls is going to have a different SQL accessor. This one is going to have one control SQL accessor, as you see up here, and this one's going to have another one. These SQL data sources, they're just like buckets that are filled with certain data in the database. After you configure this data source, it will pull certain data from the database depending on what you tell it to pull. So, for example, for this data source, I told it to connect to the Halloween database store. And I already have that set up on my computer. Next, then you just go through the wizard. If you want to, you can do it by hand if you want to. A lot of people like to do it by hand because they don't like the code that the wizard generates, but I have no problem using the wizard. You can just choose one of the products, then you select what you want, and that's about it. So I'm going to show you how to do that. So for this first drop down, we're going to, you can either do choose data source, or I'm just going to show you. When you go choose data source, it will end up making a SQL data source. So you can actually drag and pull this over. I'll do that. Okay, I'll do that for this one. SQL data source, configure data source. We'll do it both ways. So I'm going to choose, I want the drop down to have a list of all the products. Now I want the names to be displayed on the drop down, but the value that the drop down will return to code, I want it to be the product name, because this is how a product is identified, is by the product ID. Two products might have the same name. So that's about all I want for that one. Test query, it's gonna, one column is gonna have the product ID, next one's gonna have the name. Finish. So got that. Now for the SQL, for the control, I'm gonna choose a data source. So I either could have selected, say I want to make a new data source, I could make a new data source, but I just made a data source that I want to use, and I believe this is data source 3. Now, in the drop-down menu, I want it to show the names, but the value that's returned and seen by the website, I want it to be the product ID. So the user that's actually physically looking at the website, like when he goes here and sees something on the drop down, I want it to be the product name. But for the rest of the code and the rest of the website, I want it to see the product ID. So we've connected this SQL data source to the drop-down control. Now I'm going to show you the second way to make a SQL data source. It's just another of them anyways. So instead of dragging the SQL data source and dropping it into our design view, I'm just going to make a new SQL data source. This is another option the wizard gives you. So drop down, I only have one SQL data source on my computer right now. I want, in my details view, I want the details view to show me all the information about the product. Really don't, let me think. Product, I want to have the product ID, I want to show the name, I want to show the short description, long description. I don't care about the, let's say I don't care about the product ID, and I want the price. Now I've got everything selected that I want to see in this details view control. Now I've got to tell it that I want whatever is displayed in this details view, I want it to be dependent on what is selected in the drop-down menu. So that's the next thing I'm going to do. Click on the Where button. This is where we connect or link together the drop-down menu to the details view control. So I want whatever is displayed here to be dependent on the product ID, and I want this product ID to come from a control. The control I want the product ID to come from is the drop-down list 2, which is just drop-down list right here. Now that I've selected all the correct options, I'm going to add this to my SQL expressions. Click OK. And I've successfully linked the details view control to the the drop down menu. So also where I wanted to I thought there was a test. I could have sworn there was a test. Maybe not. Maybe it's on the next page. Okay, so let's go next. Test. Okay, here's where we can test the query to see if it's going to do what we want it to do. Now it asks. Now this details view will only display something when it gets input value. So I'm going to put down a product ID that I know is in the database. I know this product ID is in the database, and I'll show, and this is what all the information that's going to be shown in the details view. So it is working. There's one last thing we have to do though. We need to enable this to be postback. So in our properties options for the drop-down list, I've got to look for enable postback, auto postback. I want the auto postback to be true, so that every time this is a different option is selected from the drop-down menu, it will refresh the page from the database or from the server. It won't just keep the data which is currently on the web page stale. It will refresh it to reflect the correct properties. So let's run the database or let's run the web page and see if everything is working. Now, of course, this one's working. We already saw that this one works. Let's see if the one that we just made works. So, okay, and it changes. So this is how you link a drop-down menu to a details view control. This is also the same exact way you would link any two controls for Visual Studios together. One way. There's always, seems like in Visual Studios, there's always more than one way to do everything. So I hope this helped. Thank you.